Welcome back, everyone, to Industry Growth Leaders. I'm your host, Michael Simon of Quantum Veil AI, and today I'm being joined by Kelly Laurel, President and CEO of SurgiBox Inc. Welcome, Kelly.
Thank you for having me, Michael.
Yes, ma'am, my pleasure. And just a little bit of background here for our listeners. Kelly brings over 35 years of leadership experience, including nearly 25 years in the U.S. Army, and now leads commercialization of the SurgiField system. It's an ultra-portable solution that creates sterile OR-like environments in minutes anywhere. And Kelly, so having said that, I'd love for us to dive right in. You recently stepped into the role, the CEO role, at the beginning of this year after consulting and serving as COO. So if you could, share for us your journey, how it all began, starting from military service to private industry and now leading SurgiBox.
Well, thanks, Michael. I appreciate that. And thanks for making some time to talk about this technology.
Of
Yeah,
course.
I retired from the U.S. Army in 2013, so 13 years ago. Had a
Mhm.
great career, did a variety of things in military medicine, and to include, being a CFO of a military hospital and doing different things at higher levels within the Pentagon, being a legislative appropriations liaison for the military, not including just healthcare, but other sort of factors, and then also working for the Secretary of the Army directly. So this sort of had some interest. After I retired, I went to work for the private sector, worked for a very large international uh, medical manufacturing, helping them do business strategy and growing market share, and then transition to a different segment of that industry to help them with the energy side of it. And then I thought I'm going to really retire and enjoy life while I still had some miles ahead of me to go, and thought I would spend my days playing tennis and, being in my sourdough era. Then this little company out of Harvard and MIT kind of came up with the idea at Harvard and then fully incubated at the D Lab with MIT, reached out to me and said, "Hey, can you help consult? We have this really cool technology." And once I looked at this technology and having been involved in military medicine, I thought this really could be a game changer for our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marine, right? This could really reduce long-term health conditions associated with post-surgical infections, which is a big issue.
Yeah.
So I was really just drawn to this. My husband also served 30 years in the military and was part of this standing up the Wounded Warrior Brigades. And so understanding what that impact is to wounded service members was really also something that drew our attention. So I thought, okay, I can carve out a few hours of my day, help this little company that was sort of finishing their R&D stages before getting into fully commercialization. But as you start digging into this and realize what this technology is capable of, it's so much more and bigger than just providing an OR-like condition on battlefield or remote or, post-crisis. It had bigger implications on how we actually deliver surgical care globally. And so that couple hours a day turned into all day long and more hours and pretty much they reeled me in, which was great. It's like I said, it's a passion project and something worth coming out of retirement to be involved in. And as you mentioned, I was full-time starting last year as COO, and then the board asked me to take over as the CEO this year. So just kind of to backtrack a little bit, right? This technology is ultra portable, meaning it fits in a backpack, weighs under 10 pounds, can be deployed in minutes, under 5 minutes, 3 minutes if you're pretty proficient at it, and creates that environment that if you were just in the OR has a higher level than air exchange rates than we require in OR, pushes HEPA filtered air into an enclosed space. It's essentially an inflatable surgical drape. And so when you start thinking about that, right, and how this can be, besides saving lives in rural areas, like reducing mother and infant mortality rates from dirty C-sections just because of a lack of infrastructure, this just has more, like I said, in our everyday lives. And how do we make this technology something that can be used day in and day out and be viewed as a premium, high quality product to help address population needs for simple surgeries that can be done in office now, right? Let's take simple surgeries out of the OR, which is typically bottleneck, and move them into office space. A private practice hand surgeon can now do procedures on demand or, podiatric medicine for feet. So there's just a lot of application. And when we really look at this, sort of launching SurgiBox 2.0, as I like to refer to it, how do we change that narrative? How do we make this a product that can be used every day to really help population demand? I'll pause there because that was a lot to unpack, and we'll bring in some other aspects of it with some of your other questions.
No, of course, that was fantastic. A really good introduction to the product and how it works. And, what I really would like to shift to is, you did an excellent job of describing how it works. When we originally spoke, you highlighted some powerful cases from battlefield and disaster zones to rural clinics, ICU bedside procedures, and even private practice office examples. So, can you share a few of the ones that stand out, like the one that you had mentioned to me when we originally spoke, that are, helping out with surgical backlog? I believe it was for
Sure.
the
I
woman who
mean,
had a
one of our
mastectomy.
earlier, before we had full regulatory approval, we had humanitarian use exemption in Ukraine and in Myanmar or Burma. And so having that early humanitarian use exemption allowed us to get some really interesting use case out of it. For example, there was a woman in Myanmar who had Paget's disease, bone disease, that had metastasized to her breast. She needed a mastectomy. And I think when we first built this bubble, nobody was really even thinking about mastectomies, right? We were thinking of abdominal, thoracic procedures, a variety of other things, but we really weren't thinking about women's health in that way. And, what do you do when you have a disease and your breast needs to be removed and you have no infrastructure? So they successfully did a mastectomy in a very, I guess, austere environment in Myanmar, and it was successful, right, and saved her life. We have numerous cases from Ukraine. Initially, they were done at the front lines, lots of intervention at the front lines. And now we're supporting a hospital that's about 60 kilometers from the battlefield, which has overrun with a lot of injuries, shrapnel injuries, and other sorts of explosive type injuries. And these aren't necessarily combatants, right? These are women and children, and civilian personnel that aren't really involved in the fight, but are receiving injuries from the conditions that are going on there. And this hospital is running 24 hours 7 doing operations. They only have so much capacity in the operating room. So this has been really helpful to them to be able to do procedures that require operating room like conditions to do them safely outside of that operating room. We're talking about doing external fixations, skin grafting, that sort of thing.
Yeah, this sounds like a real game changer, from everything you've described. It's really fascinating to see how many, cases and scenarios it's helped people so far. And so, when we look at the ways it can help people, I'm sure there's been many challenges across the way too. And, my next question centers around that a little bit. So what would you say are the biggest barriers to surgical access globally right now, whether it be infrastructure, training, infection risks, or just capacity in general? And then how does SurgiField, help address them?
Well, that's a really good question. So I think to your point, right, when you look at what those challenges are, is infrastructure happens to be a big concern globally, right? Billions of people do not have access to clean, safe surgical infrastructure. It's not always the case, right? There could be a low population of surgeons to actually do the surgery. But what we've read from a number of different articles and surveys. So if you take the Royal College of Surgeons out of the UK, non-emergency surgery, something that's not going to kill you today, but surgery that needs to happen. So non-emergency surgery, the backlog is over 1 year. And when they did the survey, they recognized that surgeons are spending one, maybe if they're lucky, 2 days a week in the operating theater because there's just not enough capacity. And you may be geographically landlocked from adding this additional capacity. You may not have the capital revenue necessary to build that infrastructure because it is expensive and time consuming. So people are waiting. And sometimes when you wait, you still become a burden to that healthcare system, right? You're still in pain or you still have other symptoms associated with needing to have that surgery, whether it's a hysterectomy or a hand surgery or what have you, that you still become a burden to that healthcare system while you wait for that surgical intervention. And when we look through the data from the UK specifically, these surgeons want more time in the operating room. So we thought this is a way that you can relieve that bottleneck of scheduling bottleneck by moving those simple cases out of the operating room. And could be also things like wound debridements, right? From diabetic foot ulcers, as those continue to progress, people may ultimately end up needing amputations of their toe or their entire foot. But these wounds need to be addressed and stay in front of them. And so if there's a challenge of getting into the operating room, this could have a significant impact on someone's livelihood. So this is just a technology that can certainly alleviate some of that bottleneck that we're seeing. Some countries have even bigger South Africa is almost 2 years waiting for surgical schedule.
Hmm. Yeah, I can imagine. Like, I never even considered, I mean, I know there's going to be backlog, but to that extent, I had no idea, nor did I think like such a simple solution like this, could just help alleviate that for so many people under so many different scenarios. And, if we zoom out a little bit, again, you talked extensively about the product and how it can be used. Really appreciate that. So, getting back to, let's talk a little bit about the future here, or maybe even some trends we're seeing going towards the future. Is there any, particular goals that you and the company have for this technology on how you want it to, evolve or expand, to get to others who may need it as well?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think biggest challenge is people don't know what they don't know, right? So we
Mhm.
really have the burden to try to get the word out there that there are these technologies that are low cost, quick to deploy. It's not a capital expense; it's a supply expense, right? You single use inflatable drape, the machine you would use over and over that pushes the HEPA filtered air, but still also very lightweight and compact. But it's trying to get people aware and get their heads around the thought that you can do surgery now out of that typical operating room. The operating room is the heart of a hospital, and how efficient and cost effective you run that hospital determines everything on that financial bottom line for that hospital. So the more that they can do procedures and increase their throughput to address population needs, I think is really important. So our biggest challenge at the moment is getting the word out, letting people know that there's, so this awareness campaign, if you will, that this
Mhm.
technology exists. Then we know that there are going to be surgeons who, want to try one or two procedures, a low risk procedure, and see how it goes for them before they really move into this acquisition. So it's really, how do we get that message out? How do we, convince and show other use cases so surgeons are comfortable and confident that they can do the same procedures that they needed to do in an operating room now outside of that space, whether it be in their office or an exam room or what have you. So we're really focused right now and trying to get that word out. So being on a podcast like yours is very helpful. So I appreciate that. Maybe somebody out there listening will know somebody or be interested. And of course, that would be great. They can always contact us. But that's really it, right? Try and get that awareness and adoption out there. We have a number of pilot projects going on to have additional use case information in a variety of geographies with a variety of procedures, from very complicated ones to complex, from military to civilian. So we're doing a number of things, but it takes time. And as a small company, we're always in the capital raise mode because you have to sort of survive that period of time before you get to full commercialization and adoption with those revenue streams coming in and orders with acquisition. So it's that survival period while you're drawing all that. We've done a lot in terms of de-risking this with the regulatory. We received our
Mhm.
CE mark, which allows us to sell throughout Europe under the new standard. We received that at the end of last year. We've also received approvals in a number of geographies to include UAE, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Jordan, and Japan. And we're working on a few others at the moment.
Excellent. So, pretty close then to full commercialization, if I understood that right, because, you've already cleared so many regulatory hurdles and you're cleared for all those geographical locations. So right now, the main focus just seems to be, trying to expand into even further markets and then making sure you provide the education and awareness for the product as well.
Exactly. And ramping up our production. So while we are FDA registered, we're registered for use in an OR. We're still going through the process to get full regulatory approval for use outside of the OR in the US. So we know that market, is a great market. US is a great market, obviously.
Yep.
And that will take a little bit more time and effort. And what will help bolster that approval is all these other use cases that we're gathering from these other geographies. So we're kind of in the process now of going through the FDA. We're scheduling our pre-sub meetings so we can find out what sort of requirements they'll have to give us approval. Like I said, we're registered for use only in the OR, which there's still, I think, a value proposition to be had for use in an OR, because now all of that time associated with uh, sterile, sanitization and cleanup and prep for surgical case, doing the case, and then clean up post surgery, that can really be collapsed, right? Because you no longer have to worry about the entire environment, but only exactly where you're doing surgery, right? This just brings it right down to the point of where you're doing the surgery. So your throughput, even in an OR, can be really enhanced by using this technology.
Yeah, sounds very exciting. Is there a rough timeline on that right now, that process with the FDA? Like, could you guess
Well,
or?
Yeah, well, I think we'll know more when we have our pre-sub meeting. So we're hoping to have that this fall. And we're hoping it's not a very long list, right? We're hoping to avoid needing to do clinical trials because we'll have so many use cases already in hand, right? So we can
Mhm.
show the efficacy and safety associated with the surgeries that are currently happening. So we'll understand that a little bit more, but I'm hoping it's less than a year. But as I said, the FDA has their own processes, and I am not a regulatory expert. We have a team and a consultant that's supporting us with that. But I
Right.
know that will be a huge milestone. Then that's sort of the crown jewel to be able to get that full clearance with FDA.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like really it's only a matter of time. Read several of the testimonials, on your website from many doctors who have used it in many different scenarios, and really, it sounds like the product just sells itself. So, when we're talking about the government and regulations, yeah, that's going to be a little bit tedious, and the government's not exactly known for being efficient. But again, I think that's only a matter of time before that gets done. So, future definitely looks
We're
bright.
hopeful. We think the future is very bright. The applications are large. We even are contemplating next gens and other market segments. Maybe we make a pediatric model. Maybe there's one for animals. So we just really think that there's a lot of different application. We are working also on a next gen model specifically for the Department of War under a grant. So there will be another version of this already. It's about 50% developed.
Mhm.
We're finishing our prototypes and we'll be testing it with some military organizations. But I think the future is very, very bright. Our big challenges, like I said, is scaling up manufacturing and getting that awareness campaign out there. So we're working
Yeah.
hard to get some volumes available, have some systems available for all the clinical trials and all the physicians that are asking us to try it. Some physicians like to be on the bleeding edge of technology and they want to try everything, and some want to be in the back and wait till there's been hundreds done before they jump in. And that's okay, right? We're okay with either part of that, but we want to obviously support those that are enthusiastic and willing and get them some systems so that they can try these procedures.
Yeah, I think it's important to keep it like a pretty good balance there. I mean, yeah, you want to make sure you get them in, and start using them now, but yet at the same time, I can understand some caution wanting to see some more examples too. So I get that. And when it comes back to, raising that awareness, education and scaling, can you talk a little bit about what you guys are doing now to help, shift that process towards that?
Sure. So, we attend a number of trade shows. We have a few distributors in probably about 20 different countries that also are going out doing trade shows or demonstrations to whomever, either hospital networks or particular organizations to try to get that awareness out there.
Hmm.
But, I think there's a lot of, journals and things that we can also hope that we get some information, you get these peer reviewed journals, because I think physicians do look for the science behind things, right? They don't just want the hype. They want to know that it's been validated and tested. So we're working to be able to have some published studies coming up, some peer reviewed published studies in the very near future. We're doing a project with the military in India. We've done some projects. Obviously, we're still working with the U.S. military very closely as are aware of our current technology and we're a part of that development, and then have asked us to do some different modifications for our next gen. So we're doing that on a civilian basis. We're working with some NGO groups in Nigeria to help reduce mortality rates. A lot of times, a normal physician, or regular normal, I don't mean to say it that way, but a physician is is used to doing a variety of surgical procedures, even though they aren't a surgeon, right? Out of necessity, and typically because of where they might be located, your general practice physician is familiar with doing a number of surgical procedures to include C-section. In the US, we would only expect OBGYNs to be doing those type of procedures, or trauma surgeons or surgeons in general to be doing those procedures. But in other countries, you know, uh, general practice physician can do those procedures. So we're working on a project in Africa at the moment. We have also done some work with a Jordanian physician who runs a wound care clinic who's focused on diabetic foot care. So
Okay.
he's used our system as well. We have also a surgeon in Saudi Arabia who's a trauma surgeon and the president of the surgical society there. And his take was quite different, right? So he mentioned, when you have an ICU patient and there's some indication that you need to go back in for surgery, that there's a significant risk associated with taking that patient from ICU back into the operating room, the in transport adverse events often happen as you're removing all their patient monitoring. And that's assuming your operating theater is available, right? Oftentimes it's got scheduled cases. And so you're waiting to move that patient. And so his point is, why not just do that procedure immediately as soon as it presents in the ICU so that you have a better outcome for the patient and have a quicker intervention. So that's one of the things he's interested in doing, is some ICU procedures to show that this is more efficient and better outcomes, right? More efficient for him and better outcomes for the patient.
Yeah, that's incredible. And I really have to commend you and your team, on the work you've done. That's a really great network. It sounds like you've got in place already, and I think it's only going to expand and improve as time goes on. So really, again, admire what you've accomplished there. And, you mentioned technology quite a bit. So what I'd like to do now is shift the conversation a little bit to my favorite topic, and that's the topic of AI. And so what we've seen is, AI is reshaping healthcare and med tech. So how would you seeing it applied across the industry from, let's say, product development and regulatory work to commercialization and operations?
Yeah, AI is a whole nother element to this, right? That I think the team members that are, on the team that are younger than I am, are more on top of that. And they're sort of relying on these AI tools to help us guide on what are the requirements of certain regulatory environments, because you can now have tools that sort of point to what's needed and how you go about registering, to AI for helping us identify who our target audience might be, right? So we are using some AI applications in that way to figure out who's the right people to get in front of, right? And there are tools that can help associate. We probably aren't leveraging it to the greatest extent that it could be, but we certainly are, open to that. We had talked about adding some additional technology. In someday in the future, there might be cameras that go inside the bubble that you're connected to some AI tool that maybe helps you with an assessment, damage control assessment, or some surgical assessment of what the case is that you're looking at, and give you some guidance that way. So there's a lot of ways that AI and IT kind of video teleconferencing can be connected to the system to help support somebody who's in a remote area or who's never encountered a particular situation that they're facing, but obviously they have to take immediate action. There's no time for a medical evacuation or unable to medically evacuate. So we definitely see some future with how AI can support how surgical care is delivered while still using our system.
Mhm. Absolutely. And you mentioned some very good examples there, which I've seen as well. And so my follow-up to that would be, what have you seen that's really working well? And then where would you see, like, let's say, if we're talking about some bigger opportunities to leverage AI further at scale, if you had a wish list, what would you like to see on that list?
Wow. I don't know if I'm the right person to answer that, but I think, there's AI that can help sort of do simulation and show how this deploys or how this might fit into their application, right? I think you can even program AI to create videos for you, and a library of tools, right? Like if you had somebody who had a crush injury and you need to do a fasciotomy, for example, to relieve pressure, you can have AI now show you how to set up, do the procedure, and move on, right? And so having this library of specific type use cases, I think would be really interesting, right? Because the
Mhm.
same principles are going to set up, but they're going to help you identify what needs to be done and how to do it, and maybe help guide the physician who may not have done hundreds of these, but may have only done it twice and maybe not since med school or something. So I think
Mhm.
that would be a really strong, powerful training tool for providers that are encountering a number of interesting conditions, right? And
Yeah.
maybe they need to do an amputation. Maybe somebody had a terrible snake bite or injury and they need to amputate, or you're at risk of having losing a life. So I
Mhm.
think there's a lot that can probably be done with AI to help really bolster the training and application side of this.
Yeah, I'm in full agreement. And then if we get back briefly to, you said you wanted to expand the, reach of the product to other individuals and the education. Have you ever considered using AI, in that capacity as well for outreach?
We have. We've worked with a couple of groups to help us figure out how to identify and how to reach out to different organizations. For example, let's go back to the hand surgery. And I bring that up because I've had 3 hand surgeries myself, right? And so, I retired out of the Pentagon, so I was in the DC area and had repetitive motions, call it a BlackBerry injury, right? And so
Mhm.
I had some tendon that needed to be released on my thumb and Quervain's situation, right, where I went in for a couple of routine steroid injections, but it didn't alleviate the pain and problem associated with that. And so once the physician determined, okay, now you're a surgical case, right? This sort of intervention didn't work. We need to go in and do a tendon release surgery. I rent room time on, first Wednesday of every month or every other Wednesday or whatever his cadence was, but he was already booked and I had to wait several weeks before my surgery schedule. And by the time I went and had my surgery, the surgery literally took under 5 minutes. And, I still had to wear the bonnet and the gown and, get cleaned up to go into the operating theater. And how much cooler would that have been if we just did it right in his office, right? I wouldn't have had to been in pain for so many more weeks. We would have been able to quickly address it and we would have been able to move on. So we're thinking like, how do we use AI to identify these private practice hand surgeons, for example, a very specific niche area, orthopedic hand surgeon specialists, and how can we, communicate to them the value proposition of using the system? You no longer have to pay for that rental space in the operating room. You can increase your throughput. You put me out of my pain sooner and get on with your next case. And so I think
Yeah.
AI would be a really powerful tool in helping us figure out that market segment, for example. So we're trying to use that now to say, how do we find private practice hand surgeons in a particular geography? And how can we
Okay.
then engage with them? Maybe we could have cool little videos that showed how a hand procedure could be done very quickly in our system. So yeah, we
Excellent.
we aren't leveraging it to the fullest extent, but we're dabbling at the moment.
Yeah, that's definitely, a place where you could leverage. I think there's definitely more of a conversation to be had in that regard. But, I want to stay focused again for now, just again on the product and, your outreach methods, among other things. So, based on what we had discussed so far, this is another question I like to ask too. So, when I had my initial, or I should say, when my assistant had its initial conversation with you, were you under the impression that you were speaking to a human being, or did you think like this might be, AI?
AI. And
Mhm.
there's a couple of key things that I recognize now in AI. And I think initially I thought, wow, these people are writing, or not necessarily you, but others, right? But now
Mhm.
I think everybody's using AI and there's certain key phrases in the way they write things that now I know I'm talking to a machine and it's very quick
Mhm.
to respond. So it sort of starts to happen that way. And so I think that's a really big concern is now, how do you differentiate yourself, right? As you start to use AI and as everybody's using AI to send all these emails and your inbox is filling up with 50% of them are not even people anymore, right? On
Mhm.
behalf of other people using AI, it's hard to sort through that, right? Because
Yeah.
now there's so much more volume of outreach. And my concern is, how do you differentiate and how can you make people feel comfortable, even though you're using AI, that there's really something there? And
Yeah.
yeah, like I said, and so I recognize that it was an AI tool just because there's some very key things that all AI seems to use, right? And the way that
Mhm.
they set things up and the phrases that they use.
Yeah, it also underwent some rebranding recently as well. So I think it got a little mixed up there. But, in general, how I've seen it perform under those scenarios is, I'll just use an example. Like 9 out of 10 people will say, like, oh, I thought I was speaking to a human being. Something like that will happen every now and then. But, I take a lot of pride in how it functions in terms of, it's what it's supposed to be doing. It's called a sales development representative. That's just one solution that somebody could potentially implement. But what it does is it takes, certain criteria of what you're looking for. In my case, I'm looking for industry growth leaders, people like yourself who are spearheading new technology, at the top of your field and looking to get more education and awareness out there to the public about your product and what you do. And then how you've also leveraged AI as well, in your practice and seen it leveraged elsewhere. And then the SDR will just, do a search. It'll find somebody who matches that profile, do an introduction, and then it gauges their interests. And if they're interested, then it just puts it on the calendar. And then that's when I do my formal introduction. So very good system. It's still, always being updated, but, very proud of it and, how we can reach out to others. So just wanted to make you and everyone else aware of that too, because you said that's something that's, you and your team were looking for, and we see that quite often in these
I
fields.
can yeah, I can certainly see how that's, you know, um, a multiplier. right? You only have so much bandwidth. And of course, each person has an overhead cost associated. So when you're a small startup and everybody's doing 5 people's jobs at once, right? Because you're just a small team, I can certainly see how AI can be such an advantage for helping you schedule, to help you keep up with that outreach, to maybe tag things that are worthy of a follow-up discussion where everything may not be, right? But help you really sort through, where you need to spend your time. And I think AI tools associated with that will be really helpful. Calendaring, scheduling meetings, organizing your inbox, so that you spend the time on the things that need the attention.
Absolutely. And Kelly, as we come up on time here, one question that I always like to end with is this is going to be a little unique for you because, there's not
Okay.
very many people who do what you do. But, let's say for leaders, entrepreneurs, or professionals in innovation heavy fields, what advice would you share about adaptability, spotting paradigm shifts, and balancing new technologies with caution for individuals who do similar to what you do?
That's a really good question. I think part of it is there's no shortages of good ideas. And I think people are innovative in nature, right? In certain geographies, even more so than other places, right? But people like to innovate. But not every innovation can bring you money or as a
Mhm.
business. And you really have to focus on, what is that go to market strategy? Who is your buyer? Who will be paying for things? So when you think about a technology, you just really have to know if the economics are there behind it. Could be a really cool gadget, but there may not really be a business plan, which will then really be a challenge for you to raise the money that you need, unless you're well capitalized on your own. And there's certainly those people out there for sure. But if you need to go to the market and find money, having that really tight business plan on how that idea changes, what's that impact and what's that economic incentive, right? Because a lot of investors don't really just buy into a great idea. They want to know how my $1 gets me $5. If it saves lives along the way, fantastic. But how do I make money? And how are you going to make money? And that's really a hard part. So when you're these inventors really close to your technology, you really have to think, how does the business overlay with this technology? Is there really a there? And how do you then go on this path of convincing investors to come along on that journey? And I think that, that's been a struggle initially because you think you're going to go out and save all these people's lives and maybe an investor doesn't really care. He just wants to know how he makes money. So you really have to think about how your technology makes money. And it's great if it does good, right? But, even though that's attracted me is the impact that this could have, but it still has to have a sound business plan. And so
Of
just
course.
keep that business lens on at all times when someone's coming up with an invention. I think that's
Yeah,
key.
there's always, a lot of hype. When I first read about, your product, I said to myself, wow, how has this, not blown up even more yet? And while there has been many successful stories, many lives saved, still got to make sure the bottom line is there. But it certainly is trending in that direction, given your market expansion so far and everything that's already in place for further expansion. So again, I just see that as a matter of time in your particular case.
No, I really appreciate that. Again, I think we're all that have been on this journey for a couple of years with the company really believe in the technology, really believe it's impactful, and now we just have to make sure that that business plan is compelling and convincing to investors. And hopefully we've done that now, and hopefully we've shown how broad that market can be, and it's not just waiting for the next crisis or mudslide or earthquake, but it can be used every single day to make people's lives better.
Absolutely. And Kelly, for our listeners and viewers here, where can they go to learn more about you or SurgiBox? Just if they want to do some research or potentially even
Sure.
reach out to work with you.
So certainly anyone can send me an email, kelly@surgibox.com. And of course, our website, surgibox.com, has some videos on there, some testimonials, and we try to show some different market segment applications. So really would welcome anybody to visit our website or reach out to me directly, and we can see how we can help. So I appreciate that.
Outstanding. Well, thank you again, Kelly. This has been very eye-opening. Really appreciate your time, knowledge, and experience. I wish you great success and hope you take care.
All right. Thank you, Michael.